At noon on the 29th of November 1910, the Terra Nova left Lyttelton, New Zealand for Antarctica, carrying Robert Falcon Scott and his party. The scientific equipment on board would be used to investigate the Antarctic continent and the icy waters of the polar oceans. After battling her way through 600 kilometers of pack ice, Terra Nova reached the smoking cone of Mount Erebus at the edge of the Great Ross Ice Shelf. There they established the base for an expedition which was to yield valuable oceanographic and other scientific data, although it's remembered almost entirely for Scott's heroic trek to the South Pole and the tragic death of Scott and his companions in their last camp.
Here in the Museum of the Scott Polar Research Institute, we hold much of the equipment used by Scott and other early polar explorers. Our early knowledge of the oceanography of the polar regions has been gained by primitive means and equipment, but at the same time, much valuable information was obtained in this way. On Scott's expedition, the biologist and oceanographer was Edward Nelson. Here we see Nelson lowering an early model of Nansen bottle through a hole in the ice using a frame. He operated in conditions of minus 35 degrees Celsius or below. He also used a special sledge which he designed to tow his equipment out onto the ice. And here we see a model of this sledge built by Nelson himself. Using this primitive equipment and under these extremely arduous conditions, he still obtained very valuable data, and he recorded it in a meticulous way. Here we can see one of his original logbooks with his name on it, in which he recorded his current meter measurements. He kept perfectly clear notes about the direction and magnitude of the currents measured with an Ekman current meter, and we even find in here that he mentioned that a seal was giving trouble and may have vitiated this reading. Now, Nelson did not go to the South Pole with the ill-fated party of Captain Scott, and he survived, and we can use his results today to help us build up our picture of the nature of the Southern Ocean.
One of the first ships designed specifically for marine biological research was Discovery 2. Between 1925 and 1939, she made 13 Antarctic research cruises. Conditions on board could be tough, but the scientists and seamen between them carried out a wide range of oceanographic experiments, collecting plankton and collecting water samples. In the onboard laboratory, samples were prepared and labeled for further study back on shore. Today, life on a polar research vessel is somewhat different. This well-appointed fish laboratory is on the giant polar stern. A ship as large as this has extensive deck space, laboratories for a range of disciplines, and a computer room. And when they're not on duty, scientists and crew can relax in comfort. But the work can still be demanding, and the surroundings still have their awesome grandeur. October 1915, the Weddell Sea. Explorer Ernest Shackleton and his men finally abandoned their doomed ship, the Endurance. For 9 months, the Endurance had drifted, locked in the ice, a tortuous journey of over 2,000 kilometers. Nowadays, buoys fixed in Weddell Sea ice are tracked by satellite. The buoys are deployed in the southern Weddell Sea in summer to be tracked the following winter. The first step is to choose a suitable ice floe. It must be 1 to 2 meters thick and about 1 kilometer across if the buoy is not to be crushed by the enormous pressures generated as ice floes grind together. Here's the path of such a buoy, tracked by satellite during an Antarctic winter. The ice was carried westwards and northwards by the currents of the Weddell Gyre, just like the Endurance 75 years before. Looking closer, we can see many kinks and loops. The ice often moves against the current, driven by strong opposing winds as cyclonic storms track eastwards across the Weddell Sea. Satellite microwave images show the central and western parts of the Weddell Sea to be ice-covered throughout the year. But we've seen that the overall movement of the pack ice is northwards, so the ice must be renewed each year. It forms around the southern edge of the sea and is destroyed by melting at the northern edge. The seasonal variation of ice cover of the Southern Ocean is enormous. Between March, that's summer in Antarctica, and August, which is midwinter, the change amounts to 16 million square kilometers. That's equivalent to 4% of the area of the entire global ocean. Seasonal variation of ice cover in the Arctic is less dramatic. Much of this region remains ice covered throughout the summer. But how does this ice cover form? Where sea ice is forming, the first thing you might notice is frost smoke, where water evaporating from a relatively warm sea surface turns directly into ice crystals in a very cold atmosphere. At the same time, the sea surface takes on the appearance of an oil slick. This is grease ice. In rough, windy conditions, grease ice clumps together to form pancakes with raised rims, like water lilies, where the grease ice in between has been pushed up by collisions. Eventually, the pancakes freeze together to form vast fields of pancake ice, which are particularly extensive in the Antarctic. As wind direction changes, the ice is torn apart, forming large irregular openings called polynyas, or long narrow leads. In winter, leads rapidly freeze over, but before long the wind direction will change again, compressing the leads, crushing the young ice, and pushing it up to form massive ridges. Pressure ridges extend down below the ice even further, maybe to 40 to 50 meters. Over the years, ridging and rafting build up great thicknesses of Arctic pack ice. Although only submarines can travel for long distances below the ice, divers can investigate individual pressure ridges. It's surprising how much light penetrates through the thin ice and the leads. As the days lengthen, there's more and more open water, which is made use of by seals and hunting polar bears. Arctic icebergs don't break off from the sea ice, but from glaciers, which have mostly come down from the Greenland ice sheet. Antarctic icebergs are usually tabular in shape, because they carve from the floating ice shelves around the Antarctic continent. Monitoring the production of icebergs tells us something about the ice sheets from which they form. Are they increasing, or, more likely, decreasing in size? In March 1989, an international group of scientists were flown to an area of Arctic pack ice to participate in CIREX, the Coordinated Eastern Arctic Experiment. Their camp is known as O Camp, O for Oceanography. The first thing that most of them must do is to make a hole through the ice to the ocean beneath. And soon the ice camp is littered with ice plugs. The holes are kept open mainly by building huts over them, which are then kept warm. Eventually there are 14 huts, each with its own experiment. Despite the tremendous forces which have given rise to this fantastic icescape, the Arctic is one of the calmest seas in the world, cut off for most of the year from the direct influence of the wind. Waves reaching the edge of the ice are gradually damped out, but although O Camp was several hundred kilometers from the ice edge, long wavelength swell could still be detected using an array of widely separated strain meters. This record shows shorter period waves superimposed on longer period waves. The shorter period signal results from flexing of the ice by swell waves, which are propagated through from the ice edge and which have a period of about 20 seconds. They are superimposed on internal waves in the ocean immediately below the ice, which cause it to move up and down by just a few millimeters. The internal waves are caused by the rough topography on the underside of the ice. The bumps and ridges leave wakes of internal waves which propagate deep into the ocean. Understanding the role these waves play in the coupled ice-ocean system is one of the main goals of the scientists at O Camp.
When you think about it for a minute, the best way to track the vertical propagation of waves is to have instruments, say current meters, at a whole bunch of different depths. But this is a real trick in the Arctic, because if you hang a current meter down on a string, you need to know which way it's pointed, and so you put a compass in it to tell which way the instrument's pointed. But compasses don't work very well in the Arctic because the magnetic field is mostly pointing straight up and down. If you're at the North Pole, getting the compass to point north would be a real trick. What we've done is build a Doppler sonar. This is a device that shoots out beams of sound in 4 different directions. The sound goes down, scatters off the plankton that are drifting in the waters here, and the plankton make a rather weak echo, which comes back to the instrument. We detect the echo and measure the Doppler shift. It shoots sound out at 160 kilohertz, and the typical Doppler shifts are 1 or 2 hertz, about that, and that's what we try to detect, and that corresponds to 2 to 4 centimeters a second of water motion. The nice part about the gadget is once that you have it oriented in the bottom of your hut, you know which way the sound beams are pointed all the way down 400 meters into the sea, and so one compass or a celestial navigation for which way it's pointed will do the job of telling you which way the velocities are for the top 10th or 8th of the polar ocean.
The alternations of blue with green and red bands in the middle of this video display in Rob Pinkel's hut show clearly the passage of a periodic disturbance, possibly a tide. For heat budget studies, it's important to know how temperature varies through the ice cover.
The ice here is about 2.5 meters thick. At the bottom surface of the ice is in contact with the ocean surface at approximately 0 degrees C. And the top atmosphere now is at about minus 35 degrees C. So that means that there's a range of temperatures through the ice. We have thermocouples positioned every 15 centimeters from the top of the ice down to the bottom.
As elsewhere in the ocean, the variation of temperature with depth below the ice was measured along with salinity using a CTD, a conductivity temperature depth probe. The profiles generally took on a typical shape. In the mixed layer, the temperature is close to the freezing point of seawater. It increases sharply between 100 and 200 meters. And below that, it reflects the relatively high temperatures of Atlantic water. Similarly, salinities in the mixed layer are low, but at depth, they show the high values typical of Atlantic water. When we use these data to calculate density, we can see that here in the Arctic, salinity has stronger control over density than temperature has. Long-term temperature and salinity data are especially rare in the Arctic, so long-lived instrumented buoys were developed. 300 meters of cable with 6 pairs of temperature and conductivity sensors attached is connected to the buoy and lowered through a hole in the ice. After it's in, the buoy will float around for up to 2 years, transmitting data from each of the sensor pairs every 12 minutes to produce a vast amount of data on seasonal changes of temperature and salinity. There's a self-propelled CTD as well. The tube contains a temperature sensor, conductivity cell, and a pressure transducer, but most of the space is taken up with the battery pack and the electronics for the guidance and homing devices. The vehicle is launched through one ice hole, while at another, divers prepare to bring the vehicle up at the end of its track. Its progress is monitored. All is going well.
That's awesome. That's great.
At the end of the programmed run, the vehicle homes back to the recovery hole and switches off so that waiting divers can retrieve it. Back in the tent, the temperature, salinity and depth data recorded by the vehicle on its travels is downloaded directly to the computer. As the vehicle dives down through the mixed layer, there's little change in temperature and salinity. Below the mixed layer, the water becomes warmer and more saline. As the vehicle moves around at this level, it encounters quite wide variations of temperature and salinity. After traveling for about 2 kilometers under the ice, the vehicle rises back up through the mixed layer again. Another group, are studying how light penetrates through the snow and the ice to the ocean beneath. A spectroradiometer on the end of a jointed arm is lowered through a hole in the ice. It will record daily variations in the intensity of downwelling light in the different spectral bands at the ice-water interface. The scientists will also study how algae living actually in the ice affect light transmission, and how this changes as the season progresses, and the algae multiply under increasing light levels. Plankton and debris also absorb and scatter downwelling light. To determine the concentration of these particles and study them more closely, a water bottle is sent down to a depth of 92 meters. The sigma T profile has shown that there's a density continuity here, where particles collect. A messenger weight is sent down to close the bottle when it reaches the right depth. Where else might organisms congregate? This acoustic Doppler image shows the intensity of scattering from particles and organisms in the water column. The red band corresponds to strong echoes from plankton in the photic zone. Below that, large red dots represent echoes from other organisms, either individuals or schools, which have congregated, perhaps because nutrient-rich water is upwelling there. These organisms could be plankton, fish, or small invertebrates, crustacea like krill, for example. Species of krill are found in Arctic waters, but the best-known krill, Euphausia superba, is a key animal in the ecosystems of the Antarctic.
The animal itself is a small shrimp-like crustacean which swims around in mid-water, filtering minute plant material from the water column. Because it sinks if it stops swimming, it has to be a very active creature, and because of this it requires a large amount of food. As with other animals in the Antarctic, it has a problem come the winter, when food material is scarce. We now know that a lot of krill survive by feeding underneath the ice, where they're able to graze on an upside-down lawn of minute algal cells. Because this growth is slow during the winter, they take quite a long time, maybe 6 or 7 years, to attain their maximum size of 60 millimeters. Krill are not uniformly distributed over the Southern Ocean. On a geographic scale, we can resolve several parts of the ocean which have very high krill abundance, whereas they're more scarce in others. The areas which have high krill abundance are often associated with oceanographic features, such as, for instance, the Weddell and Ross Sea gyres. On more local scale, they form dense aggregations which we call swarms. These can be resolved by using an echo sounder, very much as fish are detected by echo sounding. These show dense patches of krill, possibly at depths of 100 or 150 meters and extending over several kilometers. The packing density of animals in krill swarms can be very high indeed, possibly several thousand animals per cubic metre. And obviously this is very important for the krill, for their food supply, and those animals that predate the krill. Now, each individual in that krill swarm may be filtering several litres of seawater each hour, so the local impact on their phytoplankton food may be dramatic. In fact, they can clear the water column. But possibly more important from the krill's point of view is the importance that krill swarms have in the various predators that live on them. Smaller predators, such as penguins, fish, may be sampling individual animals and not too concerned about their distribution. But for a very large animal, such as a baleen whale, the concentration of food offered by a krill swarm is most important. A large baleen whale, in every mouthful, may take several tons of seawater, and in this case, this will contain several kilograms of krill if it's sampled as swarm. It's obviously impossible for a whale to subsist on krill which are available in ones and twos dispersed through the water column. This characteristic of krill, the formation of dense aggregations that are available to a wide range of predators, accounts for their importance in the Southern Ocean food web.
In the short polar summer, debris from organisms in the surface water rains down to the sea floor to sustain a remarkably prolific benthic fauna. This fairy tale landscape is the floor of the Weddell Sea. At a depth of 1,000 meters, it's being illuminated for the first time. We can see sponges, sea fans, fish, and the beautiful brittle star. Invertebrates collected from polar seas have been found to have very low metabolic rates, attaining great age and large body size. And fish living near the ice have natural antifreeze in their blood. Living at or close to the sea surface are the predatory mammals, feeding on krill, fish or squid. With a seasonal upsurge in productivity, whales return from their breeding grounds in the tropics to feed in the polar seas. The Arctic Ocean is also traversed by migrating land mammals, which can walk from the surrounding land masses onto the pack ice. The king of these, the top predator, is the polar bear, a land animal which has capitalized on the richness of the marine environment. Conservation of migratory animals, be they polar bears, whales or caribou, demands a high order of international cooperation. The situation is not simple. Many of these animals form an integral part of the lives of the Arctic's indigenous people, not just as the basis of a subsistence economy, but as part of their culture. One of the greatest threats to the Arctic is its rich hydrocarbon deposits. As techniques for oil recovery in Arctic conditions improve, so the threat of pollution increases. In 1970, the lure of oil led the United States to risk an international incident with Canada by sending the ice-strengthened tanker Manhattan through Canadian waters to get to the Alaskan oil fields. Below the ice cover, the continual presence of submarines from various nations demonstrates the strategic importance of the Arctic.
Now, the strategic and the commercial importance of the Arctic may be changed radically during the next few decades by the greenhouse effect. This is because the greenhouse warming of the Earth is going to be much greater in the polar regions than in lower latitudes, and this is bound to cause a retreat of the Arctic sea ice. Now, that retreat will open up two existing trade routes, the Northwest Passage around the north of Canada and the Northern Sea Route around the north of Siberia. Now, these trade routes at present are maintained only for a few months in summer by icebreakers, but with the retreat of the sea ice, it may be that these could become year-round open water trade routes. This would produce a revolution in the use of the Arctic Ocean for trade between Europe and Japan.
The role of the Antarctic, a landmass twice the size of Australia, the coldest place on Earth, isolated by the immense expanse of the Southern Ocean, is no less crucial to the future of our planet.
We've now come to a very fundamental realization that the polar regions play an enormously important role in regulating the physical, the chemical and biological systems of planet Earth. So that it really is for international science groups to take up the challenges and to collaborate and to cooperate in investigating many of these new and interesting global issues. Well, in the Antarctic, we have a unique circumstance whereby the Antarctic Treaty, signed by more than 20 nations, provides us with the political framework in which the continent and its surrounding oceans have been set aside for scientific investigation. 30 years of research, and hopefully many more, will allow countries to be free of the problems of conflict, confrontation and acts of terrorism, which so beleague other parts of the world, so that one part of our planet, a very important one scientifically, can be studied to aid issues of global relevance related to the life support systems of planet Earth in this very unique natural laboratory that we find in Antarctica.